Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Barnett.
Thank you for your generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been looking on the web at your San Antonio 2020 plans, and of course there's a lot more in this document than urban design and planning. It's a very large, comprehensive look for the whole city, and there are some aspects of it, though, which I think I can make some comments about. Of course, I'm a little nervous because I'm far from being an expert on San Antonio. I know a lot about cities, but not necessarily about your city. So we'll see how applicable what I have to say is really going to be. But I picked out from the essay 2020. By the way, how am I doing in terms of your being able to hear me? In the back, is that okay? Let me know if because I noticed that if I get too far from this mic, I sort of fade out. So let me know if that's starting to happen. So the first of the goals, I went through and I just picked out from the website some of the wording of goals you've already decided on. And I'll talk about the air quality. I think is mostly a transportation issue, and water usage. I'll talk about that as maybe a distributed local sort of infrastructure issue. But there seemed to be another target that you might put in there, which would be to take your development regulations in the city and the region and tune them in more directly to the natural environment. And in recommending that, I am channeling Ian McHarg, who was for many years a professor at Penn, and who was the author more than 40 years ago of a book called Design with Nature, in which he made a point which is really pretty basic, but gets ignored an awful lot of the time by engineers and designers, which is if you don't understand how natural systems work and how the natural ecology works, and you try to subdue them with engineering, you are likely to invite retribution from nature. So, if you build on a dune, the dune can be eroded and the house will go out to sea. If you build in a valley, you can have water in the basement and so forth. And what McHarg says in his book is that every school child in the Netherlands, but no engineer in America knows this. So in his book, he showed what he thought were some of the examples. Now, you're going to have to adjust because the landscape here is, of course, quite different from the landscape in Pennsylvania. But I think you can see the analogies. So he made a list of the different types of subcultures inside the environment. He made analysis, and these were done on tracing paper by people using magic markers. If you've ever used a marker, you probably know that there are fumes from these markers, so that bending over these sheets of tracing paper on the light table for hours at a time was probably an intoxicating experience for the people who worked on it. But what he was doing is he left out, you can see down in the middle of the drawing here, it says Philadelphia, but he's left out all the urban stuff, and he's showing you the basic natural landscape. The steep slopes are the dark areas, the blue are the rivers, the green are areas of various environmental sensitivity. He shows that you should have different land uses for each one. And so he then did, one of the early works that he did was a plan in a suburban Baltimore, a plan for the valleys, and he suggested places where you should build and where he didn't. It's ironic. I think a lot of this was actually implemented, but what happened is the growth in Baltimore leapfrogged over his client's county and out into further counties as a consequence of his making it more difficult to do this. This really needs to be part of regional planning. But what he does is he shows you that certain pieces of land are much more appropriate for development than others. And in the days when McHarg was working with his magic markers, most zoning codes couldn't really deal with this. But now with GIS, it would be possible to import all this kind of information. And Ian McHarg is actually, in some respects, the godfather of GIS, because a lot of it was written and invented at the University of Pennsylvania as a way of getting away from the magic markers and putting it into the computer. So the layers that you see in GIS are actually a computer rendition of the layers of tracing paper that McHarg and his students used to use and to map these regions. So what I'm suggesting is that you should bear the actual carrying capacity of the environment in mind in making land use and development decisions, and this has a big influence on sustainability. Now there's an interesting aspect to that. McHarg in his drawings tried to show how you would do different types of development to fit in with different types of landscape, but there's a question that McHarg has raised, which is that certain kinds of land are really not suitable for development at all. And so another planner named LINKAGE asked a different question, which is, okay, if the land is not suitable for development, but it's zoned for development, why is development permitted? Of course, I don't really want to take us all up to the Supreme Court on this one right now, but he wrote a very interesting book, at least this piece of it is interesting to me, in which he shows that you can discount various categories of the kind that McHarg had pointed out and allow less development on them. And although this has never actually gone to the Supreme Court, I think this is really an interesting idea. It's objective. It applies to everybody, which would appear to meet the really basic requirements of zoning. And what you do in his system, in the McHarg-Kendig system, is that as in most suburban development is based on the size of the land, the acreage is discounted based on how much of the land would have been considered unsuitable for building by Ian McHarg. And so your site A and site B in this diagram produce slightly different amounts of houses. And it seems to me this is an interesting principle which maybe you should be thinking about. So I just put these things on the table, and then I'm moving on to other issues. This is the Beddington Zero Energy townhouses. I've actually not been there, but I saw there was one of them at the expo in Shanghai, which I did see. In English talk, this is called Bldg because Z in Great Britain is pronounced Z, which makes it very hard for them to understand American trade names like EZ or something or other. They say the EZ, whatever it is, I don't know what it could possibly mean. Anyway, if you look at these houses, they have every imaginable environmental energy-saving and water-saving device incorporated in them. And I think this is an interesting, when you're talking about sustainability and reducing water consumption, which is one of the goals in your plan, there is rainwater collection. There is a possibility of recirculating water which is used from the kitchen sink and so forth. There is a possibility of decentralized electric power by having photovoltaic cells on your roof. Now, of course, what happens is when the sun shines, you get power. When the sun doesn't shine, no power. So you still have to be connected to the grid, but on a good day, you may be producing more energy than you need, and on a bad day, you then get to draw it back from the grid. This is a way, I think, of dealing particularly with increases in population, that you can hold the amount of energy use to current levels or lower levels. And, of course, one house doesn't make a lot of difference. So what's needed are programs which would encourage people to have photovoltaic cells, encourage people to have rainwater cisterns, encourage people to have charges for electric cars, which can use power from the grid at off hours when it's less expensive to generate, or and to reduce the peak hours. So what's needed, you can't depend, I think, on individual house owners to do this. You have to have programs, and I think some of the utility companies, probably also here in San Antonio, are already encouraging people to do energy audits and reduce the problems with cooling their houses and so forth. So this is another interesting area of which I call sort of decentralized infrastructure, which is possible to promote. If it was calculated for Los Angeles that if every individual house in Los Angeles had a rainwater system and used that rainwater for watering the lawn and flowers and stuff like that, washing the car, water consumption in Los Angeles could be reduced by 1/3. But to do that, you have to have everybody's in the program. Now, you're probably very familiar with the U.S. Green Building Council and their lead criteria. U.S. Green Building Council has done something extremely clever, which is they have emulated the Boy Scouts, and they have given people badges for attainment. So you can be a silver, your building can be silver or gold or platinum LEED. And this is quite a wonderful system because, in fact, people are really interested in attaining different LEED levels for buildings. What has happened now, I'm sure this is not legible, but what's happened now is that LEED has branched out into city planning, and they have evaluation for communities. And the U.S. Green Building Council is a curious organization to me. I think it has done a lot of good in raising the consciousness of people about environmental issues, and they are based on the idea that some 40% of energy use is in buildings, and they are promoting really good ideas. On the other hand, they're a private organization, and they are basically like Standard & Poor's. There's you hire the U.S. Green Building Council, and you pay them a fee, and they evaluate you. And somewhere in there's a problem, particularly when local government starts writing into ordinances that you should meet various LEED levels. So while I don't think there's a breath of scandal that has attended anything having to do with LEED up till now, I think it really is time for government to step up and to put some of these things into government administration without reference to running it through the U.S. Green Building Council. That they should be influential, but they shouldn't also be administrators. However, they have a really great list. So I've called out in green, and this may be slightly more legible than the previous slide, some of the things which are involved in LEED neighborhood development criteria. Smart location, what they call a prerequisite. So this, the prerequisites mean we're not going to consider your project unless it meets these criteria. And then you get points for your Boy Scout badges for steep slope protection, site design for habitat and wetland. Some of these things I think should also maybe be prerequisites. I have highlighted in green the ones which are strictly speaking relate to environmental sustainability. But they all do really, because locations with reduced automobile dependence reduces air pollution. So I'm not going to speak about all of these tonight, but it's a great shopping list. Green infrastructure is particularly interesting because it changes the design of buildings and their setting. These are from Germany, where there's a lot of executed designs where swales are used for water runoff. So that rainwater from these buildings goes into the swale and is filtered and then goes into the groundwater and ultimately into the aquifer or into a river. And you probably have a few of these around town. But again, the thing about this kind of thinking is it needs to be very widespread in order to be effective. There's one grocery store with one rain garden on one side is fine as a demonstration, but you need to have all of the buildings where this technology can be used. And you can't use this in the center of the city where the water is already being piped into a pipe system. But in a lot of places in the metropolitan region, it's very relevant. I also commend to you the idea of the green parking lot. As so much of American urbanism is based on having large fields of parking around the buildings, here's an opportunity to use these open spaces for more than one purpose. So the advantage of trees, and it's difficult to plant trees in a parking lot because trees ecologically are not used to having heat come up from underneath them. You know, they're used to the sunlight coming down from above. They're not used to reflected sunlight coming up off asphalt underneath the tree. So it's a kind of unfriendly environment for trees, but they are an important resource for providing shade and for helping to filter water. So there are a lot of different designs, and you are, I think, well placed to use a green parking lot in this part of the country. In the parts of the world where there is snow, you have an issue because the owners of the parking lot say, okay, well, you put all this stuff in the parking lot, how are we supposed to clear it in the wintertime? And you say, well, you have smart people when they drive the snowplows down the aisles, and they say, but apparently the way that most people like to plow their parking lots is to just go back and forth and put all the snow on one side. And if you've got a lot of trees in there, they figure that's going to mess them up. So I've had a lot of pushback from property owners and developers on this, but that shouldn't arise here. It's a very frequent problem. And this is from the tree people in Los Angeles. These are some dimensions. What they're showing is that if you have a larger swale, like the one that I showed you from Germany, you can actually support pretty substantial trees. You can use the area under the driveway in the parking lot as a water holding area for stormwater by having a lot of gravel down there, and then you can have porous paving under the cars themselves. Porous paving is another problem in snow areas because the snowplow blade can pick the porous paving up, or so I am told by developers. But again, this is a program which would change the microclimate. You can change the microclimate around a shopping center about 4 or 5 degrees, making it cooler by 4 or 5 degrees by having policies like this. So what I'm doing is I'm switching around from issue to issue. The next one I want to talk about is your transportation vision area. You want to increase ridership and you want to decrease travel time. These are, of course, excellent ideas. I've become very interested in bus rapid transit as an alternative to rail rapid transit, not universally, but where it seems too expensive to put the rail transit in. Now, the defenders of rail transit have arguments against bus transit, and they say that real bus rapid transit is actually just as expensive as rail, and there's an argument going on. The thing is, you can use numbers a lot of different ways, and what happens with bus rapid transit is you often have to rebuild the street, and they're counting all those costs, but you also get a new street when you do it. You also have to replace the bus vehicles more frequently than the rail vehicles, so it's not an open and shut case, but obviously the capital costs of putting in a lane for buses are far less than putting in the footings for rails and the electrical service for it. So I wanted to talk a little about where those bus transit lines could go. This is a typical city map in which the most vivid thing on the map are the expressways, and then the next thing you see on are the arterial streets. You don't see the landscape, and you don't see, of course, any buildings in this kind of a map. This is a map we did for the Omaha project, which was mentioned in the introduction. This is fanciful. This is drawing, but it's supposed to show Omaha at night from about 30,000 feet. And what you see here are the expressways, but they're not accentuated in this drawing. They're definitely there. They're very important. But what you're seeing is not flat like the map, but you're actually seeing landscape like Ian McHarg reminds you is the underlying nature that you have to work with. People in Omaha were kind of astonished when I was doing the urban design plan for Omaha, and we pointed out to them they had a rolling countryside. And they just hadn't thought about it that way. We pointed out in our study that they have all these creeks running through it, and they have been basically thinking of these creeks as drainage areas, and we were saying, no, they're waterfront property. But the lighted areas along here are the major arterial streets, which are also where most of the commercial development is located in the city, and I'm sure it's very similar here. And what we said is that these are the areas of civic importance, that behind them are the neighborhoods, and along these main streets are most of the businesses and the commercial areas, and in fact a lot of the institutions as well. And of course downtown, where all the bright lights are, is where it's most concentrated. So it seems to me that the places where bus rapid transit is likely to be the most useful is on these arterial streets leading out from the center of town. And now bus rapid transit has basically three parts to it. First of all, in real bus rapid transit, the bus has its own right-of-way. The second thing is that the buses have stations. And in fact, no real estate developer is going to make a decision about transit-oriented design based on a normal bus route, because somebody can take the sign down on a weekend and the bus will be on a different route in the next week. But with bus rapid transit, there's a commitment to building a station, and the passengers pay to get on the bus before. And then the other thing is that you don't have too many stops on bus rapid transit. You don't stop at every corner. Now what's happened is that bus rapid transit is coming into the United States. This is Cleveland's Health Line, which is one of the first ones which was built. And it follows one of these arterial streets out to the eastern suburbs. You can see downtown Cleveland in the background. This is Euclid Avenue. And this is Euclid Avenue rebuilt. I actually worked on the early stages of this project as a consultant. And I'll show you a close-up from the same photo. What you may be able to read is that this lane says only bus. So it meets one criterion for bus rapid transit. It has the dedicated lane. It also has the stations. I don't know exactly how this works, but I think what you are able to do is you can pay your fare before you get on the bus. And then this is the bus, and you see a passenger getting off this bus. I'm not sure whether there's even a driver of the bus in this photo, but the fact is that it's not getting the kind of ridership that you would like to see in a real bus rapid transit system, and part of the reason is there are too many stops. I mean, yes, you get more riders per stop, but you don't save them enough time. This is the vehicle. The vehicle has not as many doors as it should have, but some. It's basically like any articulated bus, but the idea is you pay the fare already, so you get on the bus rapid transit immediately, and you don't stand in line to pay the driver and then walk to the back of the bus. So it sort of is a bus rapid transit. Los Angeles has two bus rapid transit lines in their system. One is this extension out here in the San Fernando Valley, and this one, the Silver Line, runs through the center of the city and down to San Pedro. And they have mastered at the bus station part of it. You can apparently see where I got the photo. They've mastered but they're using conventional bus vehicles on it. And this was because they had a failed transit line and they had the buses. So it isn't quite a bus rapid transit either. And this is on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. This is not bus rapid transit, but it is an express bus. So this one has the element of bus rapid transit that is also important, which is that it doesn't stop very frequently. However, it shares a lane with traffic. So we're getting bus rapid transit, but the real bus rapid transit looks like this. This is in Ecuador, and you have a dedicated bus lane. You have a station in the middle of the street. You have pedestrian crosswalks to get to the station, and there's not a bus station at the next corner. And this installation is capable of providing transit, which is comparable to rail transit at a much lower capital cost. And this is, a lot of people are looking at this. This is actually a drawing, but it's for a place in the Philippines. And this is the one that many people have heard about, which is in Bogota, which is a kind of double-barreled, you actually have two bus lanes here, two dedicated bus lanes. So you have both express and local buses. And this bus in the far lane here apparently is not stopping at this station because it's an express bus. This is great, but you have to have a really wide street to be able to do it. So I think the bus rapid transit has tremendous potential, and I gather that there is being planned here as well. So it seems to me that you can give using bus rapid transit, you can have an ambitious transit scheme which in fact involves the whole metro region and not just a few lines in the center of the city. Now, other transit alternatives which are also environmentally responsible are bicycles. This is a slide from Jan Gehl. makes his point very clearly, which is that just painting a bus lane, a bicycle lane on the street is not a really great idea for getting more bicycles. I know somebody who was an inveterate bicyclist in New York back before they did all these improvements, and he gave it up. He said, I woke up in the emergency room one time too often. And it's the wing mirrors on trucks and buses are a major issue for cyclists. So what Jan Gehl has succeeded in doing in New York City, Jan Gehl, you probably know of him, is a Danish architect who is a promoter of pedestrian-friendly environments and bicycle-friendly environments. And he actually got City of New York to install a real bus lane on 9th Avenue a couple of years ago. And you see what a real bus lane looks like. There's no parking. You do have a cross street, but notice that there's a green light for bicycles and a red light for cars. So that, here's a cyclist braving 9th Avenue before the improvements and totally exposed to car doors opening or being run down by somebody having to go around a parked delivery truck. And here now you actually have bicycle paths like you do in Copenhagen or in the Netherlands, and people can travel. It's not, of course, universal in the city at all, but they are starting to install it. And it has a nice effect on the street as well, that you give up some traffic lanes, but you have the opportunity. These are basically temporary landscape islands in Times Square. Everybody predicted that traffic would never recover, so the city did a temporary installation using paint. But I think it's been a successful enough demonstration that it will be made permanent. So this is another thing you can think about here, is supplementing buses with local bicycle routes. And then there's walking. I don't know, there's a web, you can go on the internet and evaluate your neighborhood for how walkable it is. I live in one that's 100%. I live in Center City, Philadelphia. But most people don't have that kind of walkability. But what Jan Gehl is telling people is if you are, cities that are walkable are cities which have incident and stuff going on in them. So you have to create an environment that not only gives space for pedestrians, but makes it interesting for pedestrians to be there. It's a lot easier in old cities in Europe where you can actually take the traffic out of the street than it is in an American city. But again, making more room for pedestrians is an interesting option. What I was told, I was at a meeting in Michigan a couple of weeks ago, and what I heard from someone from San Francisco is that the bicyclists in San Francisco are in effect colonizing the city for pedestrians. Where cyclists have been, the areas become more interesting to pedestrians, and the pedestrians follow. I don't know what the mechanism is that's making that happen, but apparently it's observable. At first what happens is you put in the cycling lane, and then the next move after that is that people start walking in these areas as well. Okay, I've sort of put neighborhoods and growth management together because I think they're related. Of course, you have wonderful neighborhoods here, and you would like to have more people living downtown, which I will also address. But what I noticed in Omaha, which I suspect is the case here, is that if you want a new house, it's out in the fairly far from downtown, and it's not in a neighborhood. It's in a tract with a lot of other houses which are the same size and have the same lot size. And if you want to live in a nice neighborhood, you have to take on an old house, which has doubtful electric wires, possibly, which have old-fashioned plumbing and bathrooms which you want to replace, doesn't have the kitchen that you would like to have today, and so forth. So the theory of the neighborhood, which has had a revival now among the new urbanists, this is a diagram from a book from 1929 from the first regional plan. And what Clarence Perry, the author of this, suggested is that a neighborhood should have should be contained within a radius of a quarter mile, which is a half-mile diameter, which means that you can walk across it in about 10 minutes. The way you calculate that is that people walk at 3 miles an hour. So if you are walking for 10 minutes, you should be able to walk half a mile. Now, I'm always shaky on arithmetic, but I think that's right. And the idea that he had is that you would put the shops in the corner of the neighborhood. It would be a 10-minute walk from the people farthest away, but you would have a neighborhood on all four sides of this traffic junction, and among the four neighborhoods, you would be able to support enough shopping that you could have a real shopping center. And you put the community uses like the schools or the churches in the center of the neighborhood. And we looked in Omaha, and we looked at the, Omaha has a mile square grid. Incidentally, a quarter-mile radius fits into a quarter of a square mile. That is, the 10-minute walking distance fits into a square, which is 160 acres, is a quarter of a square mile. So there would be 4 walkable neighborhoods inside of this square. So you have to imagine 4 of Clarence Perry's diagrams fitting in here. What's interesting about Omaha, and I imagine is an issue here, is that they are a growing city and they are annexing additional land. And when the land that's from the county is being annexed by the city, there's a negotiated deal between the investors who want to bring the development into the city and the city. And this is an opportunity, depending on how your city council views it, of course, this is an opportunity to negotiate with the investors. And so what we put in place in Omaha, and I don't know if it works because the moment we did this, the music, real estate music stopped and everybody stopped developing. But they have the possibility, if they want to do it, to bring in annexed land into the city and make and install in the annexed land the structure of neighborhoods so that you could have a new house in a walkable neighborhood. That does not detract in any way from the older walkable neighborhoods downtown, but it gives people an option. And what happened is that they commissioned a parks plan, and the park planners went out and located within these mile squares the best places from an environmental point of view to locate a park. And then that became the city's park plan, and then every mile becomes a potential location for some kind of retail center, and then within that you have the opportunity for walkable neighborhoods, 4 in each. So it seems to me if you use the leverage that the city has during annexation, you could install more neighborhoods, and the walkability is a sustainability measure. That is what I've seen studies in which it shows that if people live within walking distance of a store, some 20 or 30% of his trips to the store will be on foot if they can get there. And I saw a study of a neighborhood in Oregon where it was a strip shopping center. It was surrounded by residences, and the question was, how did the people get there? And the answer is they all knew back ways through people's backyards. And if you went into sort of fine grain in the neighborhood and got out of your car and walked around, you could see that there were paths worn through from various neighborhood areas into the strip shopping mall. And this was pointed out to the strip shopping center owners, who were very surprised. So that there is a market out there for walkable retail. Now, obviously, when you buy a week's groceries, you need the car. But there are things you forget. There are small items that you would like to pick up which don't require a car trip. And walkable neighborhoods can reduce car trips, and they build in health. When we moved to Center City, Philadelphia from Washington, where we had to use a car to get everywhere, I lost 10 pounds. And I've only gained back maybe 1 or 2 of them. So there are people who say the obesity epidemic in the United States is a result of bad planning are overdoing it. I mean, it would be nice to say that if you don't do a good urban design, you'll die. It's an absolutely wonderful enforcement mechanism. And I think the cheap corn is probably a bigger cause of obesity, as the corn syrup that goes into so much stuff is subsidized by government programs, is probably a bigger cause. It's cheap, not very good for you food is probably a bigger cause of obesity than not walking, but it helps to be able to walk. And so, and walking along a busy arterial street is not much fun, but walking in the neighborhood and meeting your friends and neighbors is actually a reasonable thing to do. Downtown. You have a wonderful downtown here. I'm sparing showing you slides of the San Antonio Riverwalk. I reliably show them to other cities and say you should have something like this in your city. And I think you have actually a pretty lively downtown already, and a lot of work is going on with it. But you have more than one downtown. And what often happens is the areas which have the kinds of density of office buildings and shops which are comparable to downtowns exist in metropolitan regions and are not treated as downtowns. And I think that's also an opportunity. Let's talk first, though, about downtown housing. I'm going to take you to uptown Dallas, home, as many of you or all of you know, of the Texas Donut. Now, the Texas Donut is a donut because the housing is on the outside and the garage is in the center. And this does, and this is maybe a Texas cruller, as it's somewhat different configuration. And here's a situation where these are townhouses, so they have integral garages, so you can have, I'm not quite sure what I'm looking at from the air here, but the best of these Texas townhouse or apartments have actual interior courtyards which are suitable for recreational use by the tenants, and the garage is one side of the quadrangle, as in this building. And what's wonderful about the Texas Donut is that you have continuous buildings on streets, which is, I think, a great feature of urbanism. You can raise questions about the architecture of these buildings. In fact, there are people who can't get past the architecture of these buildings. I look at them and say, this is actually a perfectly reasonable place for people to live. The fact that it's made of artificial stucco, or as some people call it, pre-stressed cornflakes, doesn't mean that it isn't habitable. And these are actually rows of townhouses with doors on the street and front steps on the street, as you can see over here. And then you can drive in, and there are actually green areas in here as well as drive-in areas. And then the trouble with Google Street View is, of course, that the Google machine is in the middle of the street. So this is the same development as on your left. This is looking up the street. You see the McKinney Avenue trolley tracks on the right. And then if you turn around 180 degrees, so the trolley tracks will now be on your other side, looking down at, this is actually a pretty urbane environment. Certainly for an American city, it's residential in scale. It's 3, 4, 5-story buildings. It's got a pretty high density of people. It's walkable. If it had a bike lane, it would be even better. But it's got a trolley line that runs to downtown, which helps to make this a successful neighborhood. And, I'm willing to overlook the artificial stucco and the historic. The trouble with historic details is it's a lot harder to do than you think. So that the people who are doing these balconies and so forth, they're not looking carefully enough at the historic examples, and they're not inventing something which is particularly successful either, so they're somewhere in between these two things. However, if you look at it as urban design, it's pretty good. And so I know you're aware of this building type here, and what's happened over 25 years or so in uptown Dallas is they've built a whole district of the city which is a very successful downtown-style residential neighborhood. And inside the donut, again, the architecture is a little dispiriting, but inside the donut, you have apartments with a nice outlook. You have a pleasant atmosphere, and it becomes, I would say, a pretty desirable form of living in downtown. As opposed to the old image of downtown housing, which was the idea that the opponents of downtown housing say they want everybody to move back into the kind of apartments that people lived in before World War II, which were dark and airless and so forth. Not necessarily. Now, this is what I started to talk about before. This is the Reston Town Center, which has taken a very long time to build, but is now starting to be complete. which is not downtown. It's out in suburban Northern Virginia, and as you can see, it only goes so far. But within it, and there are a number of these places around the United States, you have a downtown environment. This is, of course, a parade. You wouldn't have that many people walking normally. But one of the things that's interesting about this is it doesn't take that much public space to make a really good place. You have wide sidewalks, you have trees, you have reasonably designed streets, and you have rules that the buildings have to face the streets. Again, back to Dallas-Fort Worth, Addison Center, which is another edge city, but designed to look like a city. It also has these Texas donut buildings and some office buildings and ground floor shops. And within it, it's a really urbane environment. So you have a real sense of downtown living, as an urbane, real city living. This is at a much more suburban location. It's a Maryland donut. This is in Bethesda, suburban Washington. City built a parking garage, public parking garage with metered parking in the middle of the block. And then around the perimeter are some new stores and some old stores. And something I think is very clever, the pedestrian walks next to the buildings. And the area of the sidewalk that's beyond where the pedestrians walk is a zone where you can do a lot of different things. You see bike racks, you see benches, you see tables and chairs. What happens is that the stores, some stores, like a store that sells cell phones, don't need this, whereas a store that serves food does. So you can have a bigger frontage for the cafe because you're not really stealing it from the Verizon store or whatever. So this is a relatively low-key, inexpensive, but effective way of making a suburban area much more pleasant by simply setting the buildings back a little bit and redesigning the sidewalk. And then finally, art and culture. This is your vision. And I think I've got this right. This is the site of the Tobin Center for Performing Arts, which I guess won't look like this for very long. And what I thought of in connection with the symphony and the opera moving to this new Tobin Center is the Cultural District in Pittsburgh. Number 4 on this map is Heinz Hall, which is an old theater which was remodeled, and then they had a new stage house added onto it for the opera. And the opera and the symphony play, the symphony plays there, the opera performs there. They also have a traditional, they have an art cinema, they have a black box theater, and then they have a lot of other art institutions. And the thing that I suggest to you as a possibility for San Antonio is an arts district, not like the Dallas Arts District, which is all the high-powered institutions in the region in one place, but like the Pittsburgh district, where you have the Performing Arts Center, and then you have smaller institutions. You have smaller theater groups, you have a lot of art galleries, you have quite a few restaurants. And the sum of that, I think, would help you attain this goal of getting more people into the cultural events, and there would be more of them. Now, I'm sure you have a lot of these different events in San Antonio already. The question is whether if you created an arts district, that might help concentrate them. And because of sort of comparative shopping, that people would get used to the idea of going to the district no matter what was playing. And then finally, one last point, going back to our Omaha experience, that if you want your Texas donut buildings to do what they do in North Dallas, you can actually put that into your code. And you can say these are what we call build-to lines. That everybody's familiar with a setback line, keep away from the house next door. This is a build-to line, have a uniform space along the street, and swallow the garages so that they are accessible from inside the block. They're also, this is the Mutual of Omaha headquarters, and they have their logo, the emblem, the chief, is a sculpture on the roof of the building. So it's on axis with one of the streets in downtown. So we said keep that open so you can continue to see the chief on the top of the building. And so you can make these districts without shaping the buildings directly. you can shape how buildings in the future will go into this area. And this is a little illustration of this. Now, if we do this in China, we can do this in 3 months. Unfortunately, in a city like Omaha, it would take a generation for this to happen. This is 72nd Street in Dodge, which is one of the big important intersections in the city, but at the present time is mostly parking lots and sort of undesigned spaces. And if you had bus rapid transit, and if you had Build 2 lines, and you had the investment, and making places like this available so that investment comes back to the center of cities is, I think, going to be a trend. This is the redesign of Coal Creek, which was one of these creeks which had been treated like a drain, and is actually now in process of being turned into a park-like environment around the creek. And then, through the magic of drawing, this is what could happen over time. Donut-shaped apartment buildings, some office buildings, transit running on the main street, and the mall sort of assimilated into this new, larger context. Could happen. I think if you're looking 15, 20 years ahead, having specific places in the city where you would like to create these walkable mixed-use centers would be a useful goal. So I put all of these things in front of you as a way of interpreting some of the language that's in your 2020 plan. So that's it. The very